Aloha mai kako! Welcome to another biology presentation. In this episode, we discuss taxonomy, organizing the tree of life. Here are the standards for this presentation. Evolution has been shaping life on the planet Earth for at least 3.5 billion years, which begs the question, how many species currently live here? Well, it turns out that that's not an easy question to answer. Most organisms that have been produced by evolution have gone extinct, and many are nearing extinction. Others have yet to be discovered. This is most certainly true for the simplest of organisms, the bacteria and the archaebacteria. But let's consider what we know. The Earth is dominated by prokaryotes, primarily bacteria. The bacteria and their ancient cousins, the archaebacteria, have been on Earth since the very beginnings of life itself, and are found in virtually all habitats, from deep within the crust of the Earth to the clouds that drift above us. The processes of evolution have been working so long on these organisms that in many ways their biodiversity is greater than all of the kingdoms of eukaryotes combined. Single-celled eukaryotes, perhaps descendants of the very first eukaryotic cells, fill every drop of water and every inch of soil. Eukaryotic fungi like this mushroom are important decomposers in ecosystems. Plants are composed of photosynthetic eukaryotic cells, and like this majestic koa tree, are the foundation of many of Earth's food chains. Animals, another eukaryotic group, include millions of kinds of insects, fishes like this deep-sea angler, and birds. Here is an eevi, one of the endemic Hawaiian honeykeepers. And of course, man's best friend, the dog. Despite our familiarity with the kingdom of animals, and who could blame us, we're animals ourselves, animals represent just a small sliver of the diversity of life on Earth. Imagine all the species of organisms found in this native Hawaiian forest. Most of them are found nowhere else in the world. Now imagine all the places in the world that are all special in their own ways, and you begin to realize there must be millions of different kinds of organisms. We estimate that there are about 8.7 million species living on Earth, with many more groups to be discovered. There may be as many as 10 million different species, different groups that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring, all arising from a common ancestor through geological time. Well, how do we organize all these forms of life? Now, there are many ways we could do this. By color, for example, we could put all the red organisms in a single group. Or we could use an aspect of behavior and put all organisms that fly into a single group. Well, as you may have guessed by this picture of an insect collection, we use evolutionary relationships as the basis for biological classification. We classify organisms together based on descent from a common ancestor. So how do we judge evolutionary relationships? We use a combination of homologous structures, molecular similarities like DNA-based sequences, as well as behavior and development to determine ancestry of a species. Evolutionary trees like this one are family trees and show descent of all species from a common ancestor through geological time. The branches represent the divergence of new species over time. The closer the branches are, the closer the species are to a common ancestor. Now for some important definitions. The science of classifying organisms is called taxonomy. The scientist is called a taxonomist, and an individual group, for example an individual species, is called a taxon. The plural is taxa for more than one group. The person credited with coming up with some of the basic rules of biological taxonomy is the Swedish biologist Carolus Linnaeus. Linnaeus lived just before Darwin, during the time of great European expansion and exploration. He himself spent time in Lapland, studying native peoples and their uses of plants and animals. Later in life, he published many books and manuscripts that described and classified species of plants and animals. Linnaeus was challenged by the sheer number of species that were being discovered. Most species were identified by names given to them by native peoples, but these names were not used by all groups, and some species were very widespread, so that they were known by multiple names. Linnaeus addressed this confusion by proposing the system of scientific naming that we use today, binomial nomenclature. Under this system, each kind of organism would receive a unique name, usually in Latin, that was composed of two parts. The first name is the genus and is always capitalized. The second name is the species and is always lowercase. To make sure that each organism has a unique name, Linnaeus devised two simple rules. The genus must be a unique name, and species names must be unique within a genus. Today, binomial nomenclature is used worldwide, so people everywhere know exactly which organisms they're discussing. Here's an excerpt from a Chinese textbook, for example. You can see the binomial nomenclature. Different kinds of organisms are classified together into increasingly larger groups by their evolutionary history, forming a hierarchy of classification groups. Genera, which is plural for genus, are grouped into families, families into orders, orders into classes, classes into phyla or divisions, phyla or divisions into kingdoms, and kingdoms into supergroups called domains. Here's an easy way to remember the hierarchy, from the most general, largest grouping to the smallest. Dear King Philip came over for great Simon. At the largest, most inclusive level, all living things can be divided into one of three domains, shown here. Domain Archaea is comprised of the most ancient forms of life on the planet, those simple cells that still exist in relic habitats that represent the environments of early Earth. Domain Bacteria is comprised of the prokaryotes, and domain Eukarya contains all organisms with eukaryotic cells, including plants and animals. So let's focus on this little tiny branch down here in the domain Eukarya. This is our kingdom, the kingdom Animalia. Now within a kingdom, individual species are grouped into successively larger and more inclusive groups. For example, grizzly bears down here have the scientific name Ursa arctos, representing their genus and species names respectively. Grizzlies are in the larger family of all bears, Ursidae. The family of bears, in turn, are part of a larger order called Carnivora, which includes all carnivorous animals, and I guess pandas. Carnivores are in the class Mammalia, which includes all animals with body hair, a four-chambered heart, and feed milk to their young. Mammals, in turn, are part of the phylum Chordata, which includes all animals with a backbone. Finally, chordates are combined with all invertebrate animals to form the kingdom Animalia. Now in this course you won't have to memorize the classification of all 9 million species, but you should know the fundamental differences that characterize the 3 domains and 6 kingdoms of life. So here's a table that compares and contrasts some important features among the 6 kingdoms. We are far from understanding all species of life on the planet, so remember that names of organisms, and sometimes entire classifications, can change based on new information. Linnaeus was considered to be the father of modern taxonomy, but it's important to acknowledge that all cultures practice taxonomy. All cultures organize life around them into groups, including our own. Consider the following reef fish, all eels. Eels have a general name in Hawaiian, puhi, and then secondary names are added to describe which kinds of eels are being discussed. So the dragon eel, puhi kawila, this big brown eel, puhi laumilo, and the one we call snowflake eel, puhi kapa. It seems as though binomial nomenclature is common to many, if not all, indigenous groups. Unfortunately, much of our traditional ways of grouping and organizing species are all but lost, although the Kumulipo provides a foundation. Classification is actually more important than you might think. Let's consider the case of two closely related and endemic Hawaiian trees, the koa and the kauaea. Our ancestors recognized them as two distinct trees. The koa, tall and majestic, was guardian of the forest and used to fashion canoes. Kauaea, on the other hand, was smaller and stunted, gnarly and tough, with wood more useful for fishhooks than canoes. Koa was common in the forests of Hawaii, while kauaea was only found in very dry areas, and over time became quite rare. Unfortunately, United States scientists considered both plants to be the same organism, called Acacia koa. As a result, the rare kauaea was exempt from protection by the Endangered Species Act. It wasn't considered a separate species. By the way, the kauaea here is the one that we planted at the main gate in honor of our previous president, Dr. Chan. Thanks for listening.